Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. And before I introduce our guest today, I'd just like to give a moment of thanks to all of our listeners. If you have told me when we first started this show in May that we'd be nearing 1,000 listeners over the summer, and we're in over 25 countries in just 3 months, I would most certainly laugh in your face. With that, we're going to attempt to expand the show a little bit more now that we see people actually enjoy listening to me babble for hours. Our main objective is two things. We're going to be launching our Discord and Patreon before the end of October, and we're also working on some design options for potential storefronts where it'll be an excellent place to purchase apparel and other accessories to let the entire world know exactly how you like your history on fire. Obviously, there will be more to come, but wanted to share the exciting news now. With that, let's get to this week's episode over the Ameircan involvement in North Africa. And for our 10th episode, and to wrap up our final series this summer, I'm going to bring aboard my first guest of the show. Everyone say hello to family friend, neighbor, and lover of all things history, Jordan.
Hey! Sorry.
Jordan has been one of those people in my own community who has a deep respect and understanding for World War II. And when I asked her to be a guest on the show, she didn't take a second to think about it. Welcome.
Welcome, Nick.
So obviously, thank you for, just joining me and having a conversation. I think obviously, where did your interest in World War II start?
So World War II, funny story, my family, that's how we made it here. If it hadn't have been for World War II, I wouldn't live in America because my family's Czechoslovakian. And so not a lot of people know that the Czechs in World War II were considered just like Jews. Like anybody who was not blonde-haired and blue-eyed, you went to a camp, they burned in fact, what they did in Czechoslovakia is they went in and they killed entire communities.
Wiped out. Yeah. The ghettos would be wiped out. And, I think it's interesting that you make that point is it was kind of like they were lesser human beings just because of the country that they came from.
Correct.
So for your family, it didn't necessarily have to do with the fact that they were they Jewish? I guess that.
No.
Okay.
So we were not Jewish. However, we were Czech, and Czechs were considered
lesser people.
Jews. Yes.
Okay. So I think,
I guess not necessarily below, but on that same class.
Like a sympathizer of.
Correct.
Okay.
So they would go into our towns and they would essentially dig pits, shoot us, and burn the entire village down. So we don't have a village where my family is from. We don't have any of that. So
it's all been, it's like you erased a piece of your heritage.
Yeah. History. And it happened though in World War II everywhere. So not just with the Jews, it happened everywhere where they just.
It was a systematic cleansing.
Correct. Anybody who was not in the plan was not allowed to live.
Right.
So it was interesting. So that's how I got into World War II.
Okay.
And also, I think Hitler's a bit of a crazy bastard. So.
I think that's putting it a little lightly. Do you know anything about the North African as an American, as someone who grew up in our education system? Do you know anything, and if you do, how much about the North African campaign?
So super interesting. I learned about the North African campaign from you and listening to your show.
Okay.
So I thought that was super interesting because that was a part that we don't really speak about.
Right.
And there's so much more to World War II that we know that it's Nazis, Jews, but we don't necessarily know all of the background.
Right. We don't. Especially as us as Americans, we think, Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And then we think D-Day.
Right.
And what a lot of people don't really sit down and think about was there was a 3-year period between that. And so, there were battles in the Pacific that were fought. We fought in North Africa. We were, the fighting was happening. We actually fought in Italy before D-Day. So, for a lot of Americans, we tend to assume and think that our first fight in World War II was us landing in France on D-Day, and that just wasn't the case. So, I'm glad that you bring that up, that you, as an adult who grew up in the same exact sort of school system that I did here in the United States, I really never learned anything either about it. I had a history teacher when I was in high school who he had a picture of Audie Murphy on his wall. And that was the first time I'd ever heard about the North African campaign outside of like a family member mentioning it maybe once or twice, but no stories. And it was, Audie Murphy had fought in the North African campaign and would end up fighting into Sicily and into Italy. And so that was like my first, I was basically an adult at that point. So, if it wouldn't have been for that one history teacher who had a picture on his wall, it never would have gotten brought up.
So how did you okay, so that's what introduced you to World War II and learning about World War II?
It was what kind of piqued the interest, the first idea of like, okay, so stuff actually did take place before D-Day.
Right.
Before this, and if you think about it, from D-Day to the fall of Nazi Germany was less than a year.
Right, but see, the war was longer.
It started September 1st, 1939.
That's what I was going to say. The war was much longer. And were we even involved in the very beginning of the war?
We were involved in aspects of, and we're actually going to learn about that a lot right here. And in the last episode, we kind of talked about where we were funneling supplies. We were making money because unlike everybody else in the world, we were secluded from the war.
Right.
Our economy, our people, everyday civilian life really didn't change outside of the fact that you knew that we were in a war and we had people that were going to war. But even at the height of it, it was still the same. We didn't have attacks coming here. The closest they ever got was the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and that didn't last very long.
Right.
And so we were making money. So we were involved. The Studebaker car company that used to be in South Bend, Indiana. So they actually used to build trucks. And that is what a large portion of the Soviet Union used on the Eastern Front against the Nazis.
Oh, wow. Well, because I know that the country, like the women and anybody who was here, we took over the home front, which makes sense because then we went to work in the factories and all that.
It was how, and that led to, just hindsight thinking, that led to a women's empowerment.
That's right. Look at me here now.
Exactly.
I empower myself.
You're a business. Exactly. You're a business owner. So, for you, that was kind of like, yes, we know about the women's suffrage movement with Susan B. Anthony, different things like that. But World War II, women went to the workplace in masses and were doing blue collar, white collar. They were very well skilled trades, educated.
Well, they were in the Studebaker factories. Yeah. They were making ammunitions. They were building cars at that point because there was no men.
No,
the men who were here could not physically do that.
It was old people, people who could not serve medically, and women.
And that's who we depended on for the war.
Exactly.
Which is really, if you think about it, it's not good to go to war, but it's really cool that is part of our history that we actually, as the world,
mobilized as a country.
As a country, we came together. When you see right now everything in our backdrops that is going on, we can't get on one page with each other,
right?
But we could then, and I think that is a very big piece of learning that we need to do now.
Yeah, why at that point in our lives, and there were many other things. Albeit our country was in a terrible state as far as racial tensions went. Yeah. Even, this is obviously 20 years prior to the civil rights movement. However, it was, the 40s, 80 years after the Civil War had ended in the United States.
Yeah. So, and we were still dealing with we are still dealing with those same
exactly.
things. So, what a lot of people don't know is our Mr. Nick here never talks about himself. So we're actually going to do a Q&A for our dear friend Nick today.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, this is going to be super, super fun. Okay. So we know that why you got into World War II history. So is your family, were they in World War II?
So I did. I had quite a few family members that were involved. So I had a great-grandfather on my mom's side who landed in France on D-Day.
Okay.
He survived the war, came home. I had a uncle or great uncle on my father's side that had fought in the Pacific in the Army,
Okay.
and he had fought in Luzon and had in Leyte, and he had been awarded. He was highly decorated, but never talked about it. My interest in World War II.
So you take after him then?
No, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that. What's funny is, most just due to my age, a lot of these men I never got to meet.
Would you want to meet? Like, if you
yeah,
could?
Absolutely. I think, obviously the fact that they're my family, but as we know today, the stories are disappearing on a rapid moving pace.
That's why I love what you do here, is because you're bringing back these and you're educating. Like, I listen to every episode. Like, as soon as it comes out, it'll flag me. Like, that, because I'll text you and I'll be like, can you send me some more content? Like, I'm out right now and I have nothing to listen to. But that's why I think it's good, because I think that if you don't heed history, you're going to repeat it.
Absolutely. And especially, with the war in Ukraine, there is multiple mentions of neo-Nazis and or Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. And we're approaching, next year will be 80 years since the Allies began their liberation in Europe.
And there are not a lot of survivors left.
There's not a lot of survivors left, but, we still feel it. We all
do.
And it's all still there. So for me, my study in World War II came from that drive of, I never knew those stories from my own family. There's millions of people in this world that have the same experience.
It's the same thing. So I know my story, which is not talked about in our family, because if you know anything about the Czech culture, we do not discuss ugliness. Like, it's like we don't discuss that. Like, it's just like a touchy subject, but it's handed down through like almost like lore,
right?
If that makes any sense,
right?
So do you feel like you have those lores within your family?
You know what? Yeah, I do, because I didn't really truly understand my family's significant involvement, their sacrifice, any of that until, I was an adult. I think I was probably out of the Air Force at that point.
I was going to say, do you feel like you had that same sacrifice when you went into the Air Force?
I feel like it's totally different, and not
and why do you feel that?
And not a bad. I think the world in itself was a different place. But my big push for me to join was 9/11.
Okay, so I have friends who, much like you, they were either just leaving, like one of my best friends at the time was just leaving the Marines.
Right.
And when 9/11 came, he was like, take me back.
Right, exactly.
Because this is not...
We're going back to war. So for me, 9/11 was what kind of projected me towards that, like, okay, I'm going to join. However, what the global war on terror did was we were fighting organizations and...
And are you allowed to talk about where you...
Oh, yeah, no, I didn't do anything but hang out in Montana. And so, but the theory behind it, and, guys that I had served with that were my leadership that had went over and served, for them, they talked about how, there were no uniforms. It wasn't like clear as day who you're fighting. So I feel like there is a huge difference. And I think media tends to, sway a lot. I remember growing up, I watched Donald Rumsfeld, send,
oh my gosh, we're showing our age right now.
Right, exactly. And I watched him at my kitchen table, initiate Operation Shock and Awe.
Yeah.
Like, I watched that from my kitchen table. My great-grandparents did not have that in World War II. They heard about it on the radio 2 days after it had happened, or, they got it in the newspaper, or a telegram came and they found out 3 weeks ago that their cousin was killed. And so I think for the most part, I think the entire world has changed, but we all came from this point. And with that, I think in this episode, we're going to look at the answers to those questions.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wasn't done yet. Okay, I have so much up. Okay, so here's the thing about Nick. Nick never discusses himself. I've lived next door to him for forever, I feel. He never tells me about himself. He never tells me any of the cool things that he does, which Nick is a really awesome guy. He never toots his horn, never talks about anything, right? So me and his wife were pretty good friends. Love his wife. Taylor's the best. Love his children. So Taylor the other day, she was like, oh, I said, Nick gave me some reading I need to do. So I have to read this whole book. And I was a little stressed because, life.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to do it. I was like, I'm going to get it on tape so I can listen to it while I work. And she said, are you talking about Nick's book?
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. So, not only do I have your wife's copy, I have my copy.
Perfect.
So I read your book, and nobody knows you wrote a book.
Nobody knows
Nobody knows.
I did, in fact, write a book.
And Nick is turning red right now because he's like, how did she do this?
So I wrote that book. I don't even know if I had...
Tell us.
I don't know if I mean, it's... I don't...
Well, first let's start with, okay, little background.
Yeah.
The book. What is the book? What is it called?
So it's called Zwilling, and it's a fiction book. It's not nonfiction. It's not real. When I was in college, I had kind of written a little bit. Just I thought I'd wanted to be an author. So, and obviously with my love for World War II, I'd written about these two brothers who were separated.
Wait, you missed an entire chapter of it when you went to Germany with your wife.
I did. I went to Germany with my wife, and we went to Dachau concentration camp, and that was kind of like a pedal behind the book, and really kind of drove me to write. So ultimately, real quick notes version is I think I wrote it in 2019.
I'm going to be honest. I read the book. It is an amazing book. I love the book. I wanted number 2. Like I literally, it was like me with your podcast to her though, because we kind of like had to do this behind your back because
I appreciate that.
We're not allowed to talk about Nick's things that he does.
Absolutely not.
No, we don't talk about that. But so she told me that you have thoughts for a second one.
I do. Obviously that has taken and I write it under a pen name. So it's my alter ego that likes to write fiction. But
so it's on Amazon. Just letting you guys know.
It is on Amazon.
My email is, and I'll just shoot that to you. It's not really. That's your last name though.
Yeah, no, they can just look it up on my last name.
That's what I was gonna say. That's your last name though, because I looked it up. But I also I was like I told Taylor. Am I allowed to use her name?
Yeah.
Okay. I told Taylor.
My wife's name is Taylor. Everybody.
I said. Because the night I was originally supposed to come over, I had ordered it and it wasn't going to be here until that day. So that's why I was like, what time am I coming over? And you're like, no, we postponed it.
I thought someone had died. I was like, oh, that's terrible.
No, it's like, because my Amazon was like 5 stops away. And I'm like, what time do you want me there? I was like, how am I going to get rid of this time? Like,
nope. So I
I bought it. But I told her that I wanted number 2. And I know that you're busy, and I know that you have a lot going on.
I'll get to it in like 6 years, probably, when I actually have free time.
Okay, but in 6 years, though, I do expect you to actually tell me.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because Nick does a lot. I mean, we can talk about this.
No,
he will not talk.
No.
But he is a bona fide author. Everybody check the book out. It's Zwilling, and then I can never pronounce your last name.
It's like Schweitzer, so obviously everybody knows my last name's Schweitzer.
Yes. Look it up. Buy it on Amazon. You will not be sad. You will read it and be super, super excited. So why did you write the book?
I was bored. That's a true story. I wrote it in I don't know. I woke up one day and was like,
I believe it. I do.
And it was perfect timing because Taylor and the kids, well, at the time it was just the kid, they were going on vacation. So, and I had to be close to work. I couldn't be away for super long. And so I was like, okay, well, can I take time off and just stay close to the house and I'll like clean up and do projects that we had to do, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I would do the projects in the morning and then I would spend about 8 hours a day writing. I did that for probably about a month in total, and then self-published through Amazon.
I will. It's amazing. Okay, and tell us what it's about now.
So Zwilling literally in German means twin.
Oh, I did not know that. And I just thought it was a cool title.
Nope. And so it means twin. And ultimately, the book is about 2 brothers, 2 twins, if you can believe that. They're given up for adoption when they are babies. And at the orphanage, there is a gentleman who is an officer in the German army who ends up adopting him. He obviously ends up going down the line of becoming a fanatical Nazi, and the other son is adopted by a a well-known Jewish family in Munich, and basically at the end of the book, their lives collide. I can't get that part away. So
we won't talk about the end, but their lives
that's
do collide.
that their lives do collide, and that's the premise of the book. And I can't give any more than that because then it'll ruin it. But yes, I do have a book.
And I'm teaching your listeners so much because they don't know anything about you.
They don't know anything about
me. I know. So what else should we talk about here? Well,
we got to get to the show here.
He doesn't want to talk about it now.
Well, we'll do a full episode on Q&A with Nick.
And you guys just send in your questions. I will drill him. Anything you want to know about him, pictures, fun times. I got it all.
Childhood scrapbooks.
I'll get it all. Okay, we're good to go to this show now.
Perfect. So, as we had learned in our last episode, Jordan, 4 days after General Montgomery and the British Eighth Army finally knocked out the Germans and pushed them back to Libya, American General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be sending the first American ground troops to Morocco and Algeria in order to push the Germans back north across the Mediterranean and back onto the continent of Europe. On November 8th, 1942, 3 amphibious task forces converged on their targets off the coast of North Africa. Over the course of the past year, America had been seething. The wounds left by the Empire of Japan were still fresh, and the entire country had mobilized at an astonishing pace. While their eyes were set on Berlin, the British knew that what they wanted to do was a near impossible task. Taking the fight to Germany was quite literally an ocean away, and their experience was non-existent. Prior to the war in 1940, the United States military power was roughly only 500,000 standing men. By 1942, when they were heading towards North Africa, their military's might had risen to nearly 4 million, my mistake. By the next year, it would be 10 million. And you can see it kind of gradually goes up until the end of the war. The first American punch thrown at the Germans would come from the hands of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who recently had been named the Supreme Allied Commander of the troops in the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. The 52-year-old West Point graduate had spent a lifetime in service. However, missing action in the First World War, many Americans and European leaders were uncertain if the young general was quite up to the task. However, the wildly intelligent tactician set out to prove them wrong and would devise a plan to pinch the Germans. Instead of taking the fight to the centralized area, he would spread them out, hitting all targets, utilizing a three-pronged attack at the same exact time. In the west, the U.S. 3rd and 9th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 2nd Armored Division, led by, we all know who he is, General George Patton, would target the city of Casablanca. The center of the attack would be spearheaded by the U.S. 1st Infantry, 1st Armored Division. It would introduce American airborne infantry to combat the 509th Parachute Regiment, all of which commanded by Major General Lloyd Frendenhall. And his task was to capture the city of Oran. That's Oran, not Iran. I just want to make that. I don't want someone to call me out and say I said it wrong. In the east, however, the British 78th and the 34th Infantry Divisions, supported by British commando teams, that would be the predecessor to Green Berets, the SAS, Special Forces, different things like that. That were these dudes. It was their first lick in combat. And they would be led by British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson. So, Jordan, let's talk about why is it even a big deal that the British are involved here? Now, the British and the French are two empires at the time, right? I guess technically the United Kingdom, technically, yes, is still an empire. However, at the time, these are two of the history's greatest empires to ever exist.
That's what I was going to say. They were the biggest and the baddest at the time.
And they were seriously across in small waterway. And the French and the British throughout history, they've had
a back and forth.
They've tolerated each other.
Correct.
Because they're
so
neighbors.
Close to each other.
It's insane to always go to war. It's nuts. However, while they didn't necessarily go to war directly with each other, they found other ways. So, right in the General Lafayette from the French came and helped George Washington during the American Revolution.
Right.
There's a lot of French soldiers who came over. The Hessians, who were German, fought for the British, and so it's kind of ironic as we look through time. You see these two empires, and Morocco is French owned, and so is Algeria.
Oh.
So when the British show up to kick them out, the French were kind of like,
not doing it.
Why are the British coming to rescue us?
Well, that was the thing, too. The Brits were very indecisive on even entering into the war, weren't they? Because they didn't want to necessarily, quote unquote, pick a side.
So, no, they wanted the peace to last.
Right.
There's a famous quote, obviously, from England's Prime Minister, where he states, back from the Munich Agreement, where he states, peace of our time. And then literally, like the next week, Adolf Hitler goes to war with Poland. But World War I's still super fresh.
Yeah, and that was a lot of people's memories of the war.
No one wanted to go to war. The only people that wanted to go to war was Hitler.
That was it.
And was the Empire of Japan. They were the ones that
they threw their hat in.
And now Italy did, but that was more of a Mussolini thing. Not towards the end of Mussolini's reign, a lot of Italians were like this. I mean, he was murdered by the Italians.
He was not. He was well favored at one point in time. He did a lot of.
Well, he gave hope. He gave hope.
I was going to say he did a lot.
And
people liked him at one point, and then it became
Then he realized he had power and took it to a different level.
And then he became the
El Duce.
Yeah.
So, one thing that's important here is Churchill now had a way that he could help persuade the Americans to come help out your French brethren.
Yeah.
Come help them.
But
And we said, okie dokie.
I was going to say, it looks like we were all about it because if you look at the numbers,
we were building.
That's what I was going to say.
We needed to go to war with Germany. That was our game plan. But England knew that we had to use them as a staging ground. We had to. Literally a little waterway. You're into France. That's where we were starting.
Right.
So England had. What were we going to do? Sail ships across the entire Atlantic? That makes no sense. And so, they had to get their first taste of combat. Mostly, it was the Italians that were in North Africa. They were the ones that initiated it. The Germans, and so exactly. So the Germans were brought in as these aides to help them. And then it kind of became like, okay, the Italians are awful at this. It's going to become a German.
They were lovers, not fighters.
Exactly. And so, and so, for them, that if we were going to get our first taste of fighting the Germans, we definitely didn't want to do it in their backyard.
I can totally see that.
So that was why ultimately, in a way, Churchill could now swing us. He could pin it on the French need us. And he knew that we needed them.
We did.
So so the option was, you're going to come help us. And the United States, while at first they fought for it, General George C. Marshall fought for it. He was basically kind of like, no thanks. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill had an immaculate relationship. So persuasive or not, we ended up saying, okay, and we're going to go to North Africa. And as we're going to find out here soon, thank God that we did.
Right.
So on the early hours of November 8th, American forces landed in Morocco. Now, it's important to know that these areas the Americans would be hitting are not defended by Germans or Italians, but that of the Vichy French. Surprise, surprise. As the Americans hit the beach, they immediately took fire from the French. While a naval battle would ensue, the Americans quickly captured the port of Casablanca in 2 days. And in the center of Oran, the U.S. 1st Ranger Battalion would hit the beaches and quickly take the battery at Arzew. However, repeated attempts would be made to land the standard U.S. infantry at the harbor. They would retreat under crossfire from the Vichy French. The initial troops that had successfully landed on the first run realized that they were on their own, and it would be their job to ensure the port facilities would stay intact. They would also have no choice but not to give up the harbor.
They have the harbor.
Exactly. While French forces would hammer the British and American troops stranded on a run, 2 days later they would receive the much-needed relief when British battleships anchored off the coast to provide naval artillery. So in the West and in the center, delays have caused a great deal of misfortune. But something in the East would happen that proved to be pervious to the victory in North Africa. Not a lot of people talk about this. Before the Eastern landing, 400 Jewish French resistance fighters of the Guillaume group launched a coup in Algiers. While they were unsuccessful in getting the Vichy French to side with the impending American landing force, they would not be able to defeat. While the 400 men within the city held their positions, they did not know that the American forces were behind schedule nearly 15 hours. Due to this, the Vichy French would counterattack and take back their former fighting positions. The French resistance had done their job. The American divisions landed in Algiers. They came across almost zero opposition. By 4 p.m. on the same day, behind delay, the head of the Vichy forces in Algiers, General Juin, surrendered to the Allies. So because of these 400 fighters, even though they were not successful in initially getting the Vichy to switch sides, they ultimately just wiped out everybody. They took the fight to them. There's 2 gentlemen, I can't remember their name, but they are heavily praised for their fighting during this time. They were both killed. However, you'll have to read up on it. It's a pretty crazy situation what these guys chose to do. I mean, they basically knew that they were toast if it didn't work out, and it almost didn't.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, 15 hours, like being behind 15 hours and leaving.
I think about like my doctor telling me that, your appointment's delayed 15 minutes, and I'm like, ugh.
Yeah, right? Like, you're like, okay, 15 minutes, like, how is this going to...
But 15 hours, and you're fighting for your life.
Our means of communications.
No, it's not like you could pick up a cell phone and be like, "Hey, what's the status, my guy?"
Did they even know? Like,
no, had no idea.
This is what I'm saying. Like, okay, well, we better just stay here and look pretty and like defend what we're doing right now because hell, who knows?
They went from trying to get them to surrender to fighting for their lives, and it ultimately paid off.
It's not what we have a lot of. There are tons and tons of tales throughout the entire war, people who just like threw themselves down for the country.
It was a cause for humanity, and I think that's where a lot of, especially French resistance, Polish resistance, Czech, the Norwegians, the Danish, you can keep going. Germany had.
I was going to say German had to.
The Soviet Union had resistance fighters.
Everybody did.
So and while some of these resistance groups did do some questionable, horrendous things, the majority of them were fighting for the right thing. And especially the French, they were giving the Germans the business.
Right.
I mean, they absolutely picked those dudes apart from the dark. And so, I mean, like modern day.
Which is not easy.
No, it's not. And so, I think it's important to understand that even in the North African campaign, those French resistance fighters were there in the trenches first. They were the ones going to it.
And it sounds like they did their job. Sounds like they fought. I mean, and that's what
they were.
War is about. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it's the men's.
Oh yeah, that 400-man sacrifice easily helped turn this operation around. I totally did.
You sometimes have to, and as a female, I'm not supposed to look at war like that, but I do look at war as those 400 men that we sacrificed. How many millions of people did they save?
Exactly. 100%.
And they knew that when they went to war that this is a possibility of what could happen.
And then they're civilians, so they're not really, they're civilian partition fighters. So
and trained rather quickly, like
and trained in the dark.
We're pushing you through.
And the thing too is, you talk about a risk. They're not protected by the Geneva Convention.
No.
So execute them. Done and done. Clean your hands with it. After you get the information you need, you're done. So they had a lot more to risk. But as we're going to find out in some later series when we start talking about France, resistance fighters were absolutely pivotal to the Allies winning the war.
They were key. They were the ones who had all of the information.
Yeah,
who knew what was going on, and these people were the ones that
they were like spies.
That's what they were. They were spies at night, and they don't really get a lot of love. But
especially here in America.
I was going to say the veterans also, I feel like here in America, we don't give them too much love either. So this is my love for you guys. Love you.
So North Africa was a rapidly developing and quickly changing theater of operations. As we had talked in the previous 2 episodes, it was a game of just back and forth. Almost immediately after the Americans and the British successfully landed on the French African coast, they turned their eyes towards the final push to move the Germans into a state of pure vulnerability, situated about 500 miles or 800 kilometers to the east of Oran, Tunisia. The Allies knew that if they had planned on working their way up through the Mediterranean and towards the city of towards the island of Sicily, that the country of Tunisia was, and more importantly, the city of Tunis, was the closest staging ground that would provide the greatest chance of success. The country itself was a defender's dream. On the western border of Tunisia and Algeria is the Atlas Mountains. The eastern border with Libya is covered with the Matma Hills and a rapid waterway. Even more so, the French had previously constructed a 12-mile, 20-kilometer wide, 19-mile, 30 kilometers deep defensive fortifications known as the Maref Line. And this was to protect Libya from an Italian invasion. Once the French fell, it was a pristine fighting position for the Axis. And General Eisenhower was now in an incredibly difficult position. He would have to send his men exactly where the enemy would predict them to go, to the north. Now, the Vichy French resistance in North Africa after the torch landings would last 2 days, and by the 10th of November, it would cease completely. The British 36th Infantry, who was a floating reserve for the Algeria landings, would quickly be ordered by Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson to head east in order to take a specific Algerian post and airfield directly towards Tunisia. While the Vichy French fighters were beaten, the political power still had a tremendous weight. French Admiral and Governor of Tunisia, Jean-Pierre Esteva, refused to close the airfields in Tunis. Doing so, the Germans were able to act 1 day faster than the Allies, and on November 9th, hundreds of aircraft began landing in Tunis, starting a massive airlift. The Germans were able to successfully place 3 divisions fully fitted and ready to fight. So it's important to understand the relationship of the Vichy French at this point. To them, in a way, there is a no-win situation. It might actually look like the Axis could lose in North Africa. There are instances of Vichy French and German forces squaring off throughout the Tunisian campaign. A great example of this would be on November 19th, Afrika Korps commanders Walther Nering demanded passage at the bridge of Medjas. The French commander, General Baer, refused, thus creating hostilities between the two forces, and while Baer's forces would be successful, his men were decimated. It was after this fight that General Baer could no longer fight along with the Nazis, and he and his men had agreed to join the Allies. Because there were pockets of Vichy French that were turning over to the Allied side, it led to a ton of, could you imagine battlefield community? Like, people are like, I'm on this side, I'm on that side, and like people wearing the same uniforms, but they're saying they're on different sides. Like,
how do you just not shoot them? And
exactly,
you know what I'm saying?
exactly.
Like, that's the problem that you're running.
So the Allies kind of realized, and the Vichy kind of realized that they needed to come up with a solution a lot quicker rather than later.
Like, choose a side.
Exactly.
Choose a side.
They nobody was truly certain what was going on. So, but they got their answer on the 22nd, and that was with the Darlin deal. This was an agreement that all French North African units would now become a part of the Allied fighting force. The Germans and the Italians are now on their own. It's really the Germans.
Yeah.
For the most fighting force. Now, the Germans were. Let me take this back. The Germans were the foundation of their attack. They would just huck Italians at the Americans and the British, and just, would not a care in the world.
Because they didn't want to lose their Germans.
Exactly. Once again, the Germans believed that they were not the Germans. The Nazis believed that they had a superior race within them, and
they did not want to lose their superstar.
Exactly.
Yes, they did not want to lose their.
They were already losing enough. And,
they were.
So
they did what anybody would do.
However, though, even with the Vichy swapping, that airlift that we had just talked about didn't make them outnumbered.
It didn't outrun.
They outnumbered the other team out. So that airlift, because of the Vichy French, it helped them, and then the Vichy French were like, "No, we're going to switch sides."
That's what I was going to say.
So that deal all the way around for the Allies. Yeah. So now, near the city of Dejbel Aboid, the 36th Brigade met to face with an elite Fallschirmjäger. So a Fallschirmjäger unit, if you're not overly familiar, that's literally the German term for like airborne units.
That's what they call them.
Yeah, Fallschirmjäger.
So it's like Zwilling for twin. Or Zwilling for twin.
Yeah, bingo. It's just a translation.
Yeah.
It's a rough translation of
cool.
like parachute infantry. And they also had 20 tanks. And obviously we know the Germans' armor was really superior at this point. And they would fight for 9 days. At the same exact time, the Italian 50th Brigade would completely knock out the 509th Infantry Regiment, or the Parachute Infantry Regiment, out of Gafsa. The Allies needed to reconnect their offense. If they were planning on beating the Germans, they would need more than a sporadic defense in Tunisia. The Panzer divisions were simply proving to be too much for the Americans and the British. The deployment of Blade Force, a specialized armored regimental group comprised of Stuart light tanks and anti-tank guns in Tunisia, proved to be exactly what they needed in order to provide flanking cover while the Allies pushed in from the north. But as the rain picked up, the northern attack was delayed, and they would not be taking place. Blade Force, already in position, set their sights on the airfields. Quickly, and under a cover of torrential downpour, the tanks broke through at Jeda and unleashed everything they had on the Luftwaffe aircraft, destroying a little over 20 then.
Yeah.
It's pretty good for a surprise attack. 20 planes, that's pretty solid.
I would take it. I call it a win.
Now, they initially caught these Germans off guard, right? They're like, how did these tanks get here? The Germans were very good at moving fast.
Right.
If there's one thing they did really great at, was moving everything really fast. And so the Afrika Korps quickly redeployed to the airfield, and that was to ward off any more armored advances. Now, Jeda would now be a focal point for the Afrika Korps, basically for the remainder of the battle, and the repeated attempts to beat the Germans, the 36th Brigade simply couldn't break the Germans' hold on the city. But since Nering had moved his troops, Médiès was now nearly undefended. On the 26th of November, the British 11th Brigade entered the city, once again totally unopposed. And while the Allied forces thought they would have enough time to set up defensive parameters, they were wrong. The next day, the Germans arrived back at Médiès in full force.
Just imagine how chaotic that was.
Yeah,
just imagine how chaotic
okay, guys,
that is.
We're going to set up everything tomorrow morning, and we're going to get ready for them, and then you wake up in the morning and they're there.
And that's like,
it's go time.
Oh my gosh. What are we going to do?
Exactly. So basically at this point, we're just getting chased. The whole Allies are just getting chased around North Africa. Now, the Americans saw this as an opportunity to fully take the airfield in Jeda and reinforce Blade Force with commandos from the 1st Armored Division. On December 2nd, they launched their attack on Jeda and were met with stiff resistance from the newly arrived 10th Panzer Division, led by Major General Wolfgang Fischer. Crippled even further, Blade Force withdrew from the battle, leaving their reinforcements who just came to help them to fight the fresh Panzer divisions on their own. The Allies would be forced to retreat again, and they needed to find higher ground if they planned on any of this working. By the 10th of December, Allied units were in Médiès and Tarouba corridor, attempting to reach the highest point known as Long Stop Hill. After consistent rain, fighting, Allies were completely exhausted and they were running out of supplies. On the 22nd of December, after almost 21,000 casualties, the Allies were forced to withdraw.
Just ran out of steam.
Just running. They're just getting, and once again, it proved that point of we weren't ready to take the fight to man Europe.
But when you think about it too, you have to think about war on its own is you don't get rest. You
It's just
don't get
chaotic.
proper nutrition. You don't get. I mean, come on. You're
It's a
living
race
wild.
it's a race to the finish.
Correct.
It's
So
it's a game of who can last the longest.
that's exactly
That's
what
all
it
war
is.
is.
That is all war is. So I mean, sometimes you just gotta say, hey,
Can't do this.
I gotta throw my cards down.
21,000 casualties in a month of fighting is
You're losing.
You're losing. That's astronomical.
And you do have to take that into account.
Yeah, and especially when you're going to go back to your home country, to the Americans, and say, hey, we lost, let's say if they lost 10,000 of those compared to the British, that's still a pretty heavy blow.
That is.
Now, the month of January proved to be, once again, back and forth fighting between the Germans and the Allied forces. However, the Allied leadership was lacking some serious coordination. On the 21st, Eisenhower appointed General Anderson responsible for the entire front. 3 days later, he was given reins of the American troops there as well. So now, let's take a little brain break. All the American troops, all the British troops, all the French troops that have now switched, they're all fighting under Eisenhower said, we're giving you the reins.
You do what you do.
Exactly. So, and at the same time Anderson was taking control of the Allied front, the British 8th Army, who's in Libya on the other side, who's led by General Montgomery, takes Tripoli. And a piece of the U.S. 2nd Corps was breaking through the Atlas Mountains into Tunisia. So now we're creating our pinch.
So do you think that the British, do you think British Army and all of that, how is that versus the Americans?
Well, so even with our leadership fighting in the First World War, that's still 30 years prior, it's not the same as the British. They've been fighting at this point for 3 years against the Germans.
So they had already knew of a dirty trick.
They knew what was. Yeah, they had. Yeah. And the British had taken some significant losses at that point. They had the resources they needed now,
and they knew what they were up against. They had previous. I mean. So maybe turning it over and saying, you know what, listen to the British because the British know what's going on here was the very best thing. Which
100%.
It may have been the most.
So now you have two fronts of Allied troops moving in on the Germans. They're both led by the British. By doing so, it set the American troops on a direct path to cut the Axis line in two, severing the Italian defenses at Mareth and the Germans at Tunis. Rommel simply could not allow this to happen and hastily put together a plan to beat them back. On the 30th, 21st Panzer Division, supported by 3 divisions of Italian infantry, would crush the under-equipped French near Fade. While counterattacks were created and employed, the German fighters proved too much, and the Americans withdrew to the town of Cibitla. On the 14th of February, the Germans launched Operation Frösenwind, or Springwind, in an aim to defeat the British and American defenses at Sidi Bouzid in the north. And Operation Morgenluft, or Morning Air, would defeat them back to the south of the city. Now, by the 17th of February, Rommel was successful, and the Allies began pulling back through the KAsserine Pass, or the KAsserine Gap to Thala and Le Kef. The Allied main fighting force would be held in the KAsserine Pass. The U.S. 2nd Corps would move its force to Debessa, where they believed the defenses would be best fit. However, Rommel saw this as a weakness and believed as he launched a full-out assault on the Allied main fighting force in the pass. He would make the gains necessary to capture the Allied supplies, and it would give him a staging area for the Luftwaffe to support them in the future. It was on the 18th that General von Arnim and Rommel's troops meet at Kasserine, prepared for their attack on the next morning. And early on the next day, the Germans launched their attack against the Allied in the Kasserine Pass. The first line of defense would be American Colonel Alexander Stark's brigade, or Stark Force. While not properly prepared, the Allies did have nearby artillery that could deal heavy damage to the approaching panzer divisions. Initially grinding them to a halt, the armies were now face to face. Intense hand-to-hand combat was taking place all across the pass. before the Ameircans could reorganize, the 131st Armored Division pulled the 10th Panzer from Sabitla and reattacked and crushed their defenses. Thus breaking through the pass, the Panzer units rolled towards Bessa, and with very, very small amounts of resistance. As the Panzers rode towards Thala, they would be slowed by the tanks of the 26th Armored Division. After days of intense fighting, the outgunned 26th would withdraw again to the front of Thala. Rommel, who had taken control of the fighting force, chased the Allies to their defenses. Fighting in close quarters, the defenders were taking a hell of a beating. The leaders were quickly realizing they might not be able to hold the line at Thala. But before failure could be assessed, 48 American artillery pieces from the U.S. 9th Infantry arrived from Morocco. Now, this was like a 19-hour journey. This was not, so you talk about literally showing up. And that's like in American football, you just need to score a touchdown, and Tom Brady comes out and he's going to be your quarterback for the final play. Like, you're good.
You know that you're fine.
These guys were their saving grace. So these 48 artillery pieces showed up. And as the Germans prepared for their finals, the Germans had no idea these dudes showed up. So as the Germans are salivating, they're like, here we go.
Because they were like, this is easy pickings for us. We're going in here. We got nothing to worry about. Just
and those 48 from the 9th just absolutely opened up.
Took them out.
Beat the hell out of
them.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's happening in the south near Sabiba. The 21st is totally bogged down. The British 8th Army was well on the attack and is now less than 10 kilometers away from the German defenses at Mareth. Now, Rommel and Kesselring were at a disagreement on what to do next. Rommel's hope was that the damage dealt at the KAsserine Pass would be enough to destroy any future plans of the Allies advancing in the west via the pass. Their goal now would be to move all the troops to protect the Mareth line. In all, the United States would be dealt a hell of a blow in the KAsserine Pass. And in just 5 days, they would be faced with over 10,000 casualties. So either 2,000 men were either getting killed or wounded every single day in that pass.
Not shocking.
It's not, but for the Americans, it's huge blow.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's not shocking when you think about what was going on, what they were faced against, because we're talking about weather, we're talking about supplies, we're talking about so much is going on.
We're literally fighting in the desert.
Not just war.
Right. You're fighting the human elements too.
So many other things going on. So is that shocking? It's a large number.
Not especially when basically everybody's a novice.
Correct. When you look at things like that and what's going on around you, you know what it's like to be in the
They set themselves up for failure.
Correct. So is it shocking? It's terrible. The loss of life is terrible.
So let me ask you a question. Do you think that the KAsserine Pass, do you think that was the moment that ultimately proved Winston Churchill right? He was like, yeah, you guys absolutely have to fight these guys here. You're never going to make it there. Do you think the KAsserine Pass was like the exclamation point to his sentence?
I think it needed to happen.
Okay. I think that's an interesting take. I am not saying the loss of life is horrible.
I mean, I'm not underplaying those loss of life.
But I
am saying that
the 10,000 casualties that happened, if we would have went straight to France day one, were coming.
Well, the same thing would have happened.
It would have been tenfold worse.
Right.
They would have turned us into hamburgers. So in a sense, I think that in a whole work week,
that's true. I didn't even think about that.
The Germans were, knocking out 2,000, not necessarily killing them, but they're taking them out.
They're taking them out, yeah.
And so 2,000, if you're taking 2,000 defenders out every single day in a fight, when one work week, Monday to Friday, man, that is bloody, especially when it's focused in a pass.
Yeah, because when you think about the pass, however, things could have been different.
For
there
sure.
could have been a lot different outcomes. So
ultimately, ended up being a not really a dent in the Allies' outcome, but
correct.
At the time, it proved a very bold point of this fight with the Germans isn't going to be necessarily as easy as we think it's going to be.
Right. And I think that that's what we needed.
I agree. Because, we assume that, and we'll talk later on it, is, the Japanese attacked us. And then we're like, we're going to fight the Germans.
Right.
We felt the Japanese were inferior.
Right.
And we thought, we're the Americans. We took on the British.
Yeah, that's what we.
And, we were built for more. And then it proved that we weren't ready for that.
War is a messy. I always go back to this. War is just a messy situation where you have to learn your enemy better than you know yourself. Because you have to anticipate what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't really know until you lose 2,000 men a day what these people are capable of, like what the other side...
what your enemy actually is capable of.
Correct. And you have to learn that at some point in order to move forward and plan for the next battle. So you would hope that the next battle you've now learned some lessons.
Bingo.
From this.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're getting ready to find out.
Yeah. But how many, does it talk about their losses of lives? Or
so, the Germans really didn't. In the Battle of KAsserine Pass, they
published numbers very often.
Or they lied about it, but the thing with the Germans was especially their minister of propaganda, Dr. Joseph Goebbels. He was a real big proponent on inflating numbers.
Oh, yes.
So, like, for him, where we see some countries where they're like, actually, our losses were 500, but in reality, it was like 10,000, right?
Right.
So they're trying to make it seem like it wasn't that bad. The Germans, the Nazis kind of did the opposite. And especially in, like, the bombing of Dresden.
So they would inflate it in order to make the Nazi party.
Oh, these people are terrible. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep fighting.
That's what I was going to say. That's how they did the propaganda. Right. They said, 5 men died. Well, that's really 150 over there that died. And we need you guys. We need our Hitler.
Look how horrible this is.
We need,
And so, like, for example, during the bombing of Dresden, I believe 25,000 civilians were killed during that. The next day, Goebbels came out and said that 250,000 were killed.
Yeah. But
we got to rally the troops.
The media machine. Like, you see it even today. It's that media machine. But that's how he fed, and that's how Hitler did
that's how he strengthened the war effort.
Yeah, the propaganda alone of what was being... I mean, if you sit and listen to Hitler's speeches and that type of thing.
It was all about rebel rousing.
That is how we did things. We got people riled up. We got them, look at German. This is our motherland. Germany, our motherland. Here we are.
We're the greatest.
Correct. And so that's not shocking that they did that. So at least our numbers were more on par.
A little bit more.
I appreciate the honesty there, even though it's not a good number.
Oh, yeah, because they did the good thing. They're like, look what we did. So now, with that being said, you made a great point. Do they learn from it? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
So in early March, the British 8th Army under the command of our good friend General Montgomery was moving west along the coast. Realizing he was becoming pinched between two armies, Erwin Rommel launched Operation Capri in an attempt to attack south towards the British-held city of Medellin. The German and the Italians were immediately met with an incredible barrage of artillery again, and it destroyed 55 of their tanks.
Ooh.
Once this happened, Rommel was basically certain of his defeat and flew to Rome on the 9th of March to discuss the withdrawal of the operation completely, where he was given more than a stern no. Not really satisfied and feeling absolutely zero support from Rome, the next day he jumped on a flight and went to Germany to meet with Hitler personally. And this pissed Hitler off. Hitler placed Rommel on sick leave. Right? So he now was refusing to allow him to return to his men in North Africa, and he would be replaced by General von Arnim as commander of Army Group Africa. 10 days after the replacement, Monty launched Operation Pugilist against the Meureth Line on March 20th. Now, due to inclement weather and the terrain, no armored units would be able to assist in the attack, leaving the infantry to fight predominantly on their own. But Monty quickly reassessed his situation and would launch both Operation Supercharges 1 and 2 and successfully made the Meureth Line no longer a viable option for the Axis. And they would retreat over the course of the next 48 hours at Wadi Akrit.
I wonder if he's actually from Sick leave.
So he's still on sick leave. He is still on sick leave. He is, yeah. And so by the end of March, the Allies would again launch another operation to break the lines at Wadi Akrit, pushing the Germans to the city of Gabes. Unable to break the Germans there, the U.S. Second Corps called upon a team effort with the British Eighth Army, and they captured the city of El Hama, making Gabes no longer defendable. Basically, it was kind of like an overlooking city into another one, so the Allies now have the higher ground. So retreating once again, the Nazis moved north. The Eighth Army is hot on their tail. And while the Germans were crumbling in the south, in the north, von Arnim was getting ready to deal the Afrika Korps their final blow. He believed that the Battle of the KAsserine Pass, the Axis had weakened the north sector due to the Ameircans, reinforcing their southern defenders during the attack. This, however, was not the case at all. Von Arnim launched Operation Oschenkopf to take the city of Mézières, Beja, El Arousa, and Dayel Aboid, in a small area known as the Hunt's Gap. The Hunt's Gap is going to be really important real quick, because at the Hunt's Gap, the British would prepare an immense and deadly killing field. So basically what that means is every square inch of that gap, of that field, was covered by coverage of multiple guns.
That's insane.
And so they're hidden away and they're just waiting.
Yeah, for when they come into that field.
Bingo. So the underassuming Germans, who basically thought at this point they were going to walk into a bakery, right, and they're going to get their donuts, they had no idea what was in store for them. Quickly moving British tanks were able to support, move, and re-support before the Germans could react. The killing fields in Hunt's Gap proved to be too much for the Axis, along with the constant air cover given by the Royal Air Force, and von Arnim officially called off the operation on March 5th. So there's a story of two Churchill tanks, right? So these big behemoth boys, and very powerful, and they were basically hidden in a ridgeline on Hunt's Gap, and a 28-car armored convoy came in. And in under 10 minutes, these two tanks totally destroyed every single one of them and killed every single man.
Oh.
They picked them off, one in the back, one in the front.
So they learned. Do you see what I'm saying? By the past. They learned by the past because they knew what was coming for them.
Exactly.
They learned.
So where the Germans thought they were going to get a squeak up on them, which would have Rommel made the decision to do this, ultimately we don't know. But von Arnim did. Yeah. And it ultimately was his rapid, like, oh, we're just going to keep going. We're going to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was already pinched. So when they rolled into Hunt's Gap, the British and the Americans were ready. They gave them their own Kasserine Pass in a way.
So look at us go. We got our payback.
Exactly.
We got our licks.
So
we got our licks.
So now after all of this, they had a pincer move that needed to be completed, and the Germans would be bottlenecked towards Tunis. The full attention of General Alexander would be the orders he had received to launch a large-scale offensive to capture Tunis once and for all. Alexander would plan for the U.S. Second Corps to attack on the north. The First Army would attack at Tunis, and the 8th would attack from Infidaville to the north. Due to the movement of the Allies, von Arnim knew a large Allied attack would be taking place and spoiled their surprise the night before it was supposed to launch, when the 10th Panzer Division and the Hermann Göring Division launched an attack at Mézières. The fight was on the morning of April 22nd, an all-out offensive from the British and American troops took place. The Americans took Hill 609, which allowed for their troops to fight Bizerta. Here, they would meet the Hermann Göring Division in hand-to-hand combat. Now, along Stop Hill, the British were able to secure the hill quickly, which finally opened the way to Tunis. The terrain leading the way for the 8th Army from Infidaville was horrid, and it was clear that they would not succeed if they proceeded with this route. So instead,
was it rocky or was it sandy?
So so they were going through a very heavy rain. It's like a sandy mud. It turns into like cake.
So I've spent time in Nevada, so I'm assuming this is more like
Bingo.
The Nevada, like the mountainous area of Nevada.
When you get the monsoons.
Yes. And so when those come down.
And it turns your yard into brownie batter.
Yeah, but it doesn't like necessarily, it's just disgusting. So that's what I'm assuming they're
Correct.
kind of like going through.
So if you can imagine these tons and tons of tanks that are trying to push through, it's just, they're
going down. Yeah.
They're just sinking.
Yeah, yeah.
So instead of reshifting, they were broken apart and they would not succeed and would support other areas of the attack, something that would prove critical. Now, the 7th Armor arrived in Medyez sector, giving the 9th exactly what they needed. The British 4th and the Indian 4th Infantry, also known as the Gurkhas, were repositioned into a narrow front and, along with artillery, concentrated their fire there. Within a few hours, the line broke, and the tanks from the 6th and the 7th Armored Divisions rushed through into Tunis, and at the same time, the Americans were successful in advancing north into Bizerte. It would be 6 days later when the Axis officially fell in North Africa, surrendering to the Indian 4th Infantry on May 13th. With over 275,000 men still in Tunisia, all of them would become prisoners of war. In all, the Allies would lose roughly 55,000 men with over 250,000 casualties.
Oh, wow.
The Axis, however, would never really recover from this. Not only did they lose roughly 50,000 men with over 500,000 casualties and 250,000 captured, they lost millions of tons of shipping and supplies. So, in conclusion, North Africa was the beginning of the end for the Nazi war machine. Their losses in North Africa gave the way to the Allied powers to push directly into Europe from the Mediterranean. It was also an embarrassing loss to Erwin Rommel and to the Nazis. The war would officially be centered in Europe, where it started with the Ameircans and their war effort. It was looking like the invasion of Europe would surely be next. So within the next 2 years, their losses in North Africa, the Nazis would collapse. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much, Jordan, for joining us this week. It has been a great pleasure, and as always, it's fantastic to speak to you about this. I love our nerdy conversations about World War II, so the fact that you're willing to come on here and embarrass yourself with me, I greatly appreciate that. I know we got off subject a couple times, but I do feel like they were good conversations. I definitely do. I
really enjoyed embarrassing you.
I appreciate that.
And also, I really enjoy all of the barbecue talk because, we're like the two nerds in the corner discussing stupid stuff all the time. That's right. I know. I always tell your wife, I'm like, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to take your husband away. I'm just a big nerd.
Hey, you know what? That's fine. So, but no, really, I've enjoyed it a lot. I really hope that we can turn this into like a reoccurring thing. Maybe we can get, a bunch of the neighbors over. We can have a real big conversation, a real long episode. We can do some Q&A stuff. We can,
We totally could. That would be so much fun to get all the families together.
I think that, I think we should. I think we should do that. That way, this World War II, the study, the conversation of it, it doesn't need to be like this overly like serious. It is serious, but it doesn't need to be like these are only conversations for the big boys. I think this is a conversation that we as civilization need to have and understand, and if we plan on never going through this again.
If you're not paying attention to what has happened in history previously, you're doomed to repeat that. And I think that teaching it to the younger generations is very important.
It is. And I think teaching it correctly too. I think not skipping pieces just because it doesn't shed a great light. Was the KAsserine Pass a great moment for the United States Army? Absolutely not. And it's still talked about and it's still studied to this day. But that's why it's important. Our United States Military Academy at West Point. They studied the battle.
But that's how you learn. So if you play chess, you know the same thing. I mean, you have to really anticipate what's coming for you.
Right.
And sometimes you don't anticipate that, but you learn from the other person.
What is it? The like actual term for insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting something different to happen.
And that's what history is.
Exactly.
And that's exactly how I foresee history. That's why I think this is all super interesting because if we aren't paying attention to what happened previously and teaching that to our younger generations, even like with Holocaust survivor stories, the museums, that type of stuff, they're not going to necessarily know what really happened.
No, no.
So
I can't tell you how many times I've been in a museum. I mean, if you go into a museum or whatever, and it's a subject that maybe you're not familiar with, like if I went to an art museum and I saw a big clay statue, like that's what it would be to me.
Right, but you don't know.
This is a big clay statue. Cool. I wouldn't understand that the statue was built by a, whatever the case might be, the story behind the artist,
Right.
how he was, homeless as a child and yada, yada, and he helped all these people out and he did this and he did that. So I think it's important for us to really understand the background of, how we ended up in modern life today.
And how we got the amenities. And like, as far as our military goes, because since World War II, of course, we've built our military up. We've done this. And this was all based on the KAsserine Pass. We learned lessons from that, though. And we've put them into play in the years since. This is 100%. how we've learned so much strategy.
It's always a build off of one thing over the next. We continuously learn. And I think it's incredibly important to us to understand that us as Americans, we didn't go in there all, oorah and, busting down doors and weren't cracking skulls. It wasn't Inglorious Bastards for us. And, we took our losses and we learned our lessons. And I think that is what makes America great still, is we take our losses and we learn our lessons. Or at least we hope to. We hope to learn our lessons.
Correct. I was going to say, I'm speaking on I'm
speaking my terms. Right?
I'm trying an optimistic tone over here instead of pointing out life. But no, it's true. You learn our lessons. And I think with loss, especially that much loss, we learned. And we got it right the next time.
Right.
And that's what matters.
That's exactly right. So, we're blowing the listenership out of the water. We're on the doorstep. We're on the doorstep of 1,000, and I am incredibly thankful for that and all of you. I'm looking forward to celebrating that milestone. Hopefully on our next episode. So in our next series, I'm going to do an interesting spin instead of a battle or combat, theater of operations. What I'm actually going to look at is personal stories of individuals who made fortunes during the war and those who were wealthy and lost everything because of the war. That new series title is going to be called Warconomy. So please make sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter by searching World on Fire, A History of the Second World War podcast, where we post insights into our upcoming episodes, pictures, stories, all fun things our community likes to talk about. Once again, thank you, all of you. And thank you again, Jordan.
Yay, thank you, Nick. I love you guys.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys, and I will see you in 2 weeks.
Hope you'll see me in 2 minutes.